conversation as much as I did. You must have seen I was quite busy in the chat myself because I found the session very, very inspiring and very, very thought-provoking. We looked at the structural and historical dimensions of racism and how they continue to persist today, how we continue to deal with them today. And while there are, and how this is now seeped into migration discourse, and therefore policy-wise and program-wise, there is a strong need to look with introspection into these programs and policies and see how we can bring the change that is necessary for a much more justice-oriented kind of governance program on migration. The two respondents, the panelists that we had today, were from the Commission on Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and somebody from the US government working on the issue on racism. And it was very enlightening to see that the views that they shared of how so much continues to persist today in terms of practice and within migration discourse. So we might want to continue to look at this and bring out examples of how racism, ethnicity, nationality, forms of discrimination that become institutionalized in some ways, how they seep into migration governance. Can we really say today, was one of the questions that I raised. One was, can we really say today that our programs and our responses in migration governance today are not nuanced in some way on racist or ethnic or nationality driven kind of perspectives? We have seen in the past year or so how even religion has come to be a source of discrimination in terms of and weaponized in migration policy. So this is a good moment for us to reflect on these things as we move on to the conversation today. For now, for this moment, on vulnerabilities. And just to start this thing on vulnerabilities, I find it very interesting now, even as I'm looking at it now, that GCM 7, Objective 7 says reduce vulnerabilities. I'm wondering why we didn't use a stronger word than reduce. And I'm thinking of discussions when we used to have on poverty, when poverty said alleviating poverty, eradicating poverty. We were working with different concepts of what to do with poverty, kind of thing. I'm wondering, when you say reduce vulnerabilities, what was in the minds of the member states? Reduce it by what? In the SDG, so we would have said put targets and goals to it. Reduce vulnerabilities by so many % or whatever, and things like that. So when you say reduce vulnerabilities, what do we actually mean by that? And how far does that reduction go? How vigilant are we going to be in seeing how much we are reducing, or how much attention are we going to give to ensuring that we are reducing, or what are the monitoring mechanisms that we will put in place to ensure that we are reducing? These are thoughts that are going on my mind at the moment, coming out of this previous discussion of a critical perspective on some of these objectives that the GCM has laid out. And that is why I really think also vulnerabilities are constructed as well by member states in migration governance, and so we in MFA have always said, instead of saying vulnerable migrants, there is no such. We have challenged even the notion of vulnerable migrants, and we have said if you take away the context of vulnerability, that is what we need to kind of focus on, because when you look at it, vulnerability is also created in migration governance. We create vulnerable situations when states as duty bearers neglect the rights-based governance approach, then that only creates situations of vulnerability. When market forces are allowed to dominate, if, for example, in recruitment processes, that creates vulnerable situations. When mobility is restricted for women bans are imposed, then you create vulnerabilities and vulnerable situations, because then women move, who are desperate to move will move through irregular channels. When undocumented and administrative issues are criminalized in migration, that is when vulnerability is again created. When narratives that are racist or xenophobic are allowed to circulate, that creates vulnerable situations. When narratives like where migrants are carriers of the disease, or migrants are taking our jobs, or migrants are these hordes, barbaric hordes at our borders, then these kind of narratives create situations in which then migrants find themselves and become vulnerable in those kind of situations. So I think these are some of the things that we have to look at when we say reducing vulnerabilities. The extent to which we will go to monitor how we are doing this is something that is worth deliberating on. Today in this session now, as we begin, we have three very good panelists who will delve more on this topic. And I will just very quickly say who they are. Paddy has also introduced them. We have Aaron from the migration, who's a migration and development specialist. He has worked in the IGAD region. He has worked with the Commission for Africa. He has been IOM's liaison officer as well in the AU, and as head of the Labor and Mobility and Human Development Program Manager in IOM in the Gambia. So he's very well involved in all of these institutions, and will help us focus on some of these issues that he has dealt with concerning vulnerability. The other person is Sarah Ahmed, who is a PhD candidate on gender and Somali diaspora and humanitarianism. She is a fellow at the University of Copenhagen and University of Nairobi. She's a policy fellow also with the Mawazo Institute, a leading woman-led African organization based in Kenya. I'm sure the perspective that she will bring on women's participation in higher education and women in value chains will help us go again, get a perspective on this whole context of women in migration and the situation that migrant women find themselves in. And our third speaker will be Memory Mandikiana, who is a Zimbabwean national, also a PhD candidate on peace, leadership, and governance at the African University in Zimbabwe. She's working on the effects of COVID on displaced children in Tongogara refugee camp in Zimbabwe. She's written a number of books, and she's engaged in human rights advocacy, peace, and governance. So thank you to all the three panelists today. And let me start then with Aaron first. And Aaron, when we look at this GCM objective, what do you think are some of the policy and governance options that address or that can address vulnerabilities? What are some of the emerging issues or broader discussion on vulnerabilities that we need to focus on? Aaron?
Thank you very much, William, for that excellent introduction, and also the background to the earlier discussion you have had, the previous session, I assume, which has, interestingly enough, very close relationships with our understanding of vulnerabilities, particularly in terms of race relations, which is a topic, I should say, that has not enjoyed a lot of discussion within the migration discipline itself. But coming to your question, the GCM and how we understand vulnerabilities. Well, first of all, it's very important to note that the discussion on vulnerabilities has taken a very, very interesting progress in the GCM document. We didn't have some of the topics that the GCM has raised in previous discussions, programmings, or frameworks even. And I'll mention one specific example. There is a recognition within the GCM that access to basic services is very essential to migrants in terms of reducing vulnerabilities, one. And the second, apologies for the background noise, if you can hear it. Another very interesting progress in the GCM is with regard to recognition that status, migratory status, has to do something with vulnerabilities, which is also very recent progress in many of the discussions that I've had the privilege of taking part. Some of the key questions on migration, in terms of including root causes, addressing root causes, in terms of expanding legal pathways, have not been articulated very well to also include how they impact on vulnerabilities. So it's a bit of, again, that unique balancing act the GCM has throughout the document of putting the human rights of migrants at the center of the discussion, while at the same time respecting the sovereignty of member states, is also at play here in vulnerabilities. It started, asking or putting the responsibility on states, and some tacit recognition that states' actions, in fact, have a lot to contribute in vulnerabilities of migrants. But I should say it fell short of completely providing that solution, which is, first of all, as much as possible, expanding regular pathways or regularizing migratory statuses of irregular migrants, one. And two, as much as possible, avoiding expulsion, forced expulsion in general. There is a qualifying word used under Objective 7 in the GCM text itself that says arbitrary, that had limited the progress on avoiding expulsion or forced repatriation in general. I'll come back again later on.
Thanks, Aaron, for that, and thank you for pointing out this thing about basic services and access to services is a good point that has been introduced, that states have recognized in terms of that would help to reduce vulnerabilities. My question to you then would be how do you think states could possibly go about implementing this, particularly at a time when we have seen that, because basic services would mean there is a cost to that. And governments, at least in many destination countries, are not willing to cough up the kind of resources that are needed to support these kind of basic services. In many of the destination countries, even in Europe, for example, where there is the challenge to the kind of welfare state and things like that, the whole question of Brexit, one of the arguments was also that these migrants are coming to take advantage of our health system and things like that. So on the one hand, you have the GCM saying basic services, access to services would help reduce vulnerabilities, and these are important to give. But on the other hand, you see states shrinking that kind of resource base that is required to sustain these services. So is this the kind of balancing act that states will have to get out of? And how would they manage this at a time like this? And we've seen the challenges at the time of COVID as how this has been really, really tested, and how so many states have not performed as much as we would have liked them to have performed, or where they could have even possibly performed. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, William. Let me first address what I think is a myth embedded in some of the narratives around the issues you just mentioned. Basically, there is no evidence to support that migrants are taking up resources at the countries of destination, especially when these countries of destination we're referring to are in the global north. But the evidence suggests that migrants are actually contributing a lot more than non-migrants. If you look at the global GDP, at least I think the figure is for 2020. Migrants' contribution to the global GDP is about 9% of total global GDP, while the number of international migrants only account for a little more than 3%. So there is that myth that we need to address, that migrants are not there to take resources away from the natives of whatever destination countries they choose to go to. By access to basic services, what we are essentially referring to is stopping the practice of states that prevent migrants, irregular migrants in most cases, from accessing basic services, whether it is in terms of enrolling their students in schools, or whether it is in terms of receiving health care, which is available to any one of the residents in their local destination. So it's more of having access to these services without necessarily having the punitive measures that states sometimes take whenever they come into contact with irregular migrants, which is detention, expulsion, and other sort of administrative measures. So it's not for me, it's not a question of resources. It's a question of A, primarily human rights, but B, administrative and legal procedures as well. Over to you, William.
And thank you for referring to that as the myth, because I strongly believe myself that is the myth when we say that migrants are taking up resources, because when you look at it, and there are enough studies to show that migrants have contributed a lot more in many cases than they have actually consumed. So that is a good point you make. When we look at, would you like to say something about this within the African context, within what is called a South-South kind of migration, the vulnerabilities that or the gaps that are now being addressed within this? Because there are several, I know that at the African level, there are several kind of regional configurations that are looking at a kind of rights-based approach to migration. Can you give us some share with us some thoughts on how this is being dealt with in that region?
Thank you, William. At the regional level, before we come to the frameworks such as the AU Free Movement of Persons Protocol, for example, which will contribute extremely positively in terms of reducing the vulnerabilities we're talking about, there are some platforms, regional platforms, RCPs, as the technical nomenclature is usually known within the migration circle, regional consultative processes, which have played a very critical role in terms of not only expanding our understanding of the migration dynamics and therefore the vulnerabilities involved in these dynamics, but also they have given us practical examples in terms of what can be done when there is alignment of objectives in interstate dialogue on migration. This RCP, the typical RCP that I usually like to refer to is the IGAD RCP, the IGAD Regional Consultative Process, and the Horn of Africa Initiative. The Horn of Africa Initiative was set up, I believe, in 2015 by 4 countries: Egypt, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan. It was an AU-led process, but only trying to address the issue of trafficking in the north, in the Horn of Africa route, that is the route coming from Somalia and Ethiopia through Sudan, through Egypt or Libya and across the Mediterranean into Europe. Now, it was very effective. It was very effective in terms of creating that political climate that would somehow facilitate the reduction of vulnerabilities that irregular migrants have routinely faced in that route. However, it did not really result in any normative or legal framework, so to speak. It was more of it remained a programmatic approach rather than a policy process. But the IGAD RCP, on the other hand, had resulted in very interesting developments, including a regional free movement of persons protocol, and including some early discussion on harmonizing some of the labor regulations so that labor mobility could be enhanced in that regard. But again, the primary problem or the primary challenge in these interstate dialogues or in these platforms, multilateral platforms, is misalignment of objective. Some countries do view migration from a development, a long-term development perspective, while some countries only view it as law enforcement or an immigration rule enforcement type of operation. That misalignment usually creates a challenge in terms of advancing any framework or any thinking in terms of reducing vulnerabilities. Over to you, William.
All right, thanks, Aaron. And I will ask you to consider one. Although you have mentioned the IGAD process, I think one of the things to look at is just the innate the journeys themselves and that are undertaken, for example, and one journey is from the Africa region to, let us say, the Middle Eastern region. That is fraught with many challenges along the way, kind of thing, and migrants do find themselves in very vulnerable situations. It would be really interesting to look at how governments that are exploring new markets, how African governments that are exploring new markets for African migrants, how do they plan to address some of these vulnerabilities that are already existing in some of the fragile kind of countries of destination, where there is already a historical record of abuse and exploitation. And I'm talking particularly about some of the Gulf countries. But I'll ask you to collect your thoughts on that. But let me move now to Sarah. And Sarah, if I come to you to ask you in terms of, because a lot of your work has focused on women, and we know that one of the responses by member states has been that wherever they find that women migrant workers find themselves in exploitative or vulnerable situations, the first thing that a country does as a response, country of origin does as a response, is ban the deployment of women. We have seen East African countries do that in relation to the Middle East. We have seen Asian countries do that in relation to migration corridors. So in your study, then, when you look at some of the movement of young people and women to places like from Africa to Europe via Libya, what are some of the kind of vulnerabilities you see, and what are the gender lens that we need to have when we are looking at some of these issues? Sarah?
Yes, thank you very much, William. I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
A little louder would be helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much, William and Paddy, for inviting me to this very important conversation. Thanks to Aaron also for that very informative contribution. Good afternoon to the participants. I'm very happy to be a part of this webinar. Today, I will speak about the topic of reducing vulnerabilities in migration, which I understand is an objective of the Global Compact for Migration. I will focus on specifically youth vulnerability from a gender perspective and from a diaspora perspective or a migrant perspective. I will share my experiences as a researcher who has lived that reality as a refugee, a migrant in Europe, and right now living in Somalia as a researcher and working on this very topic of migration, which we call Tahrib in Somali. I'll bring in a gender perspective because that's very, very important and it's often overlooked and underestimated. I commend you all for taking this very important course. I will try as much as possible to keep things very simple and very, based on my own experiences. In terms of vulnerabilities, I think oftentimes we speak of vulnerability as a concept or a construct, that's out there far away from us. But for many people, it's a lived experience. In fact, as students, to you all taking this course, I think it would be very important to sometimes look beyond these concepts, these theories, and examine things as they are, as they apply to people, because we are speaking people, we are speaking about human beings here. So what is vulnerability? How is vulnerability defined? What kind of vulnerability are we speaking about? Are we speaking about the visible ones, or the invisible ones? Are we talking about the people who have migrated and the vulnerabilities they face? Because they leave behind families, and those families or children they leave behind and often also face vulnerabilities, as I have experienced. So it's very important that we examine things from lived realities, from stories, from the point of departure to the point of destination via transit. The other thing I wanted to mention is that vulnerability is very much linked to insecurity and inequality. And there are many inequalities that people face. Now, I'm speaking from the point of view of a Somali currently working in Somalia. And I would like to share with you what migration or tahrib looks like from a lived reality. I have worked, as I said earlier, with families in Somalia for many years. I came to Somalia, as a matter of fact, myself as a diaspora technical expert to work with the Minister of Education in Somalia. And ever since then, I've been working on these topics. Now, migration in Somalia is called tahrib. And there are many young people who see the Western world as a dream destination. And that's the image that has unfortunately been created out there. It has a lot to do, of course, with citizenship, some passports being valued more for economic reasons. But many people are really seeking peace. Many people are seeking genuine peace. They are seeking to develop their own lives. There's inequality at many levels. Inequality at the age level, whereby young people face specific challenges. There's inequality at the level of gender, but also at the level of ability and disability, at the level of ethnicity as it applies to Somalia. Many of the people who are fleeing in Somalia, who are going elsewhere, who are seeking, a better life, are people who have been for many years, put under pressure. Young people who have no way out, who are not educated, who are marginalized in society. So you can imagine when you have multiple challenges you are facing as a young person from a certain ethnic background, a certain socioeconomic background, and if you are a woman, it's even more difficult. But the concept of intersectionality, for me as a researcher, it has been very powerful. I'm doing research myself, and I'm using feminist tools, because these feminist tools have enabled me to see much more than the theories and concepts that are out there have allowed many people to see. So when you have multiple challenges facing an individual, geographic, disability, as I said, even racial sometimes, you have many problems. So specific problems require specific challenges. And I have seen that it's not the minister's sons and daughters who are fleeing. It is not those people who have got wealth and have access to assets that are leaving. It is really the people who are at the bottom of society who are seeking better lives. But in the Western world, all these various groups are seen as migrants with very little recognition for all this diversity within young people. Now, I have lived in Holland myself, and when you come to Holland as a refugee, you're put in a refugee camp, and then you have to wait for a very long process, a legal process of whether or not you can stay in that country, and your future really, literally depends on a few individuals who will gather around the table and will read and decide whether or not you stay in that country, but also whether or not you have access as a human being to resources and can access and resources that are enjoyed by other people. So I have experienced that those things, specifically those challenges, when it applies to young people, they become even more vulnerable. So what I'm trying to say is that the policies and rules we put in place sometimes put vulnerable young people who are already vulnerable because of their own background. When they come to Europe or on the way to Europe, they experience even more vulnerabilities that are put in place, that are developed or created by the policies that the migrant organizations have put in place. Now in Somalia, there was a specific case of a young man who had this dream to provide for his parents. His father had died, and he had his mother and 6 siblings. And his friends had left and reached Libya, and then from there onwards, they had gone on to other Mediterranean countries. I think it was Malta, and then into Italy. And then he somehow thought that he could do the same. Now, this is a person who is considered an ethnic minority within the Somali language or the Somali country. And he left for Libya. And then there's this guy called the Megefe. The Megefe are those people, the smugglers who capture young people and keep them for ransom, for hostage, for money. And this person spoke and called and even sent a video of the young person being whipped to his mother. And this mother was living in a hut in an IDP camp, an internally displaced refugee camp that has been set by the UNHCR many years ago. And they have been living there. So they were already born into poverty, into discrimination, into marginalization. But this young man had this dream of, if my friends have made it, I can also make it, and I can help my mom and my siblings, and 5 of which were girls. And for that reason alone, it was a great motivator for him to provide, because the mere fact that he had 5 siblings who were waiting to get married, otherwise would just literally stay at home until that opportunity arises. But this person was caught and was kept there for many years. The longer you're kept, the more whipping you get, the more punishment you get. And this mother, who saw no way out, was seeking support from other people. And that's how we heard of the story. And the Megafe was asking for something like $7,500, which is in Somalia a lot of money, really a lot of money. And unfortunately, this person it was not possible for the family to raise that amount of money. There was a disconnect between the family and the community, but the family and the government as well. And this eventually led to the death of this young man. And the mother was not able to even bury her son, even get the body. So it has been really a nightmare that I have experienced personally from in the community. So these are some of the realities that we are facing. The other thing I want to mention is that there's very little known about the families that are left behind. Unfortunately, many projects are focusing on preventing young people from coming to Europe and coming to the Western world. But there's little consideration for the Western people when they come to Africa. When Westerners come to Africa, they are seen as that's encouraged. It is adored. It is something that's not a problem. They can come for holiday. They can come for work. They are seen as technical experts. They are seen as expatriates. But when an equally, a young African man, Nigerian, Ghanaian, Kenyan, or Somali wants to go to Europe for the same reasons, they are seen as a burden. And I think it's about time that the organizations that are involved in this start valuing migrants and African youth as contributors to society. And many times these young people who are fleeing from war and conflict. If utilized, and if their potential is utilized properly, they can be the agents who can go back home and bring about concrete change, in terms of peace building, in terms of constructing a different country for their children and their families. That's all I have to say for now, but I'll come back to you later. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that very personal kind of witnessing that you have that you shared with regard to vulnerability, and also the story that was shared of the young man, which I think brought out very, very well what you started by saying, that vulnerability is a lived experience. So thank you for that. I like also how you kind of showed up in the migration process. It begins from the very first moment when a migrant is leaving support systems back home, whether it is family, with culture, surroundings, leaving all that kind of sense of security and going to a foreign land or making that extraordinary journey. That is already a kind of beginning of a process of vulnerability. I like what you've said about it being linked to insecurity and inequality, which is very true. And the more we look at, understand intersectionality today, we see how vulnerability has gone into several kind of layers and layers that need to be peeled out, kind of thing. And finally, this thing about race also, how sometimes race is also one of the intersectionalities that lends itself to vulnerabilities. Very quickly, a question then to you is, when you, and you've said that people who are looking at migrants must have a different kind of perspective on migrants as development actors. I'm wondering, like you've made linkages, do you see linkages between vulnerability and resilience, in the sense that even in the story that you gave, even if the young man's life is gone, kind of thing, today we talk about him and there is his family, and in your own story, kind of thing, of where you are today, is there an interlinkage also between resilience and vulnerability, or the spirit of the migrant that is able to, you know, pass through various situations of vulnerability and still triumph? Is there something to be said about that? And what should member states do to reduce then these vulnerabilities? Very quickly.
Thank you for that very important question, William. Yes, there is a very important linkage there. I think, first of all, many migration policies and refugee policies in where I have lived in Europe don't really build an individual to be able to go back home and contribute. So I think it's very recent that we have seen discussions around, especially with organizations like Shabaka, who are talking about how we can utilize and tap more into the different possibilities that migrants can offer. Migrants or diaspora, these are all terms that we can apply here. But you know, how better to tap into the different possibilities they come with, because every migrant who comes to the Western world or who wants to travel elsewhere, even within the African continent, they are doing so with the intention of building and bettering their lives and bettering their own families' lives, and contributing significantly to their communities. This is the stories that are that many young people share. If you listen to them, what do you want to do here? Why are you here? It's to improve my life, improve my family's life. So I think we should keep that in mind. And resilience is very important because we have multiple challenges ahead of us. There's climate change we're dealing with. We're dealing with COVID-19, which has become a pandemic. We are dealing with the aftermath of COVID-19. We are dealing with multiple challenges. And so there are countries that are at war. There are floods we are experiencing. There's droughts going on in Africa right now. So when you build the resilient communities, they will be better able to cope with these challenges that they are facing. Now, what do organizations need to do? First of all, we need to consider the fact that we are dealing with human beings here. We need to recognize the ability and the potential they have as agents to go back and do something tangible. We are seeing programs that are being implemented currently, but there are far too few that enable some migrants to come back home and bring about change. But there are very few. We need to tap more into these opportunities so that they work alongside development actors. In Somalia, for example, the diaspora are the first to reach out when a calamity occurs. So that's why I'm doing this PhD research within the framework of a broader program funded by Danida, the Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs. They want to look into why and how is it possible for Somali diaspora to mobilize quicker and faster and deliver when drought occurs or when floods occurs or when multiple crises occurs. They do so faster than even humanitarian organizations. So there's a need now to understand those dynamics. We also need to consider young people not only as burden, because when you come to a community and there's a certain image that has been created of a certain ethnic group, for example, Nigerian or Ghanaian or Somali, as being a problem group. the tendency will be that in that entire community, those that they will frown upon that group, and that's stereotyping, that's bias. So we need to really consider these dynamics that young people oftentimes they really want to come and do something positive and not be destructive. The other important thing we need to consider here is we need to reevaluate some of these policies, migration policies that exist. And I'm very happy that the GCM is specifically focusing today on vulnerabilities, who's vulnerable, who's not, and why, and what can we do to improve that situation. I think it begins here, in terms of, talking about resilience of young people and vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Shara, for that. And let me then move on to memory. Memory, in your own experience, and looks like you've done a lot of work with the refugees. Although this is a GCM objective, the Global Compact on Migration, I think that there is room to discuss about mixed flows kind of thing in this compact. And GCM 7 does talk about children and the best interest of children. And in this case, in your own experience with the refugees and refugee children, because again, we know that within migration kind of programs today, sometimes it is migrants will adopt the identity that serves best for them in any given context or situation. So what is your experience with children? Memory, and what I'm coming to memory. I'm sorry, I think you lost me a little while there. Memory, I was wondering if you could say something about refugee children, even if we are talking about the Global Compact on Migration. What is some of the vulnerabilities you see that need to be addressed within migration discourse today, particularly if we are going to talk about the best interest of the child? Memory?
Activity is quite. So I'm just going to speak and you won't be able to see me via video. When we talk about children, before I go there, when we talk of migration, there are 4 different categories of migration. We're talking of labor migration, forced migration, retirement migration, and internal migration. So my focus is specifically on forced migration. And when we talk about forced migration, then we're actually looking at refugees. And under the scope of refugees, we also have refugee children or asylum-seeking children. Some of them are accompanied and some of them are not accompanied. And in terms of now their vulnerabilities, yes, they're both in the category of children and they have vulnerabilities, but this is also another
Did we lose you?
mentioned that some are accompanied. Yes, William?
No, go ahead. I think we lost you for a minute there, for a second.
Okay, so children, refugees, when they come to the camp, Zimbabwe enforces an encampment policy. And when they come to the camp, some of them report sexual abuse. They have trauma of varying degrees. They have mental health challenges. Some face physical abuse challenges, and some are even disabled. They also face language barriers, especially when they go to school. Remember, when they come to Zimbabwe from mostly Francophone speaking countries, Zimbabwe is an Anglophone country. So they face language barriers when they come to the camp. Some of them are often separated, and there are issues to do with child labor, limited access to basic necessities and services. We also have issues to do with pandemics, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. There are issues that are associated with gender and cultural dimensions, having to do with early marriages, teenage pregnancies, pledging, especially amongst the Mozambican communities. We have asylum seekers from Mozambique as well. Under basic services, we also have limited dietary diversity, and just some of the basic rights, such as the UNCRC Article 31, that children have to play. Sometimes some of these rights are not met. So these are some of the vulnerabilities that children face when they come to Zimbabwe, and they are experienced during, before, during, and after the flight experience. Like I said, when I talk of migration, I'm referring to forced migration, and therefore I'm looking at refugee seeker children or asylum seeker children. So these are some of the challenges that they face when they actually come to Tongogara refugee camp. William, over to you.
Thanks, Memory, and for sharing that, particularly in the context of forced migration. So, as you look at it, then, and as we look at the increasing kind of numbers, we see a lot of and now situations like, for example, now the emerging situation in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and kind of thing, in Afghanistan. There are a lot of situations in which children are now kind of find themselves in this difficult space. What are some of the good practices, or what are some of the practices that are being adopted, which give us some hope in the sense of, yes, states are addressing the vulnerabilities which are in the best interest of the child?
Thank you very much, William. When we talk of children, we need to understand, like from a refugee perspective, that much as refugees are perceived as a vulnerable group, refugee children are at the crux of that vulnerability complex. And it is very important that they would be protected from these kind of vulnerabilities. So it is important, especially for those that are unaccompanied, to adopt the best practice of foster care. In Zimbabwe, in particular, we actually adopt a foster care system wherein unaccompanied minors are sort of attached to a certain family, or families that are willing to take up children into their setup, and that actually gives them that ability to grow up in a family setup, and to nurture them, heal them in many different perspectives. And we have also adopted the situation wherein, we're using a partnership approach, not a silo-based approach, wherein organizations come in together along with the UNHCR and the government of Zimbabwe, just in resources together and sort of offer a holistic kind of service to not only unaccompanied minors, but to all the refugees. Like I said previously, in Zimbabwe, we enforce an encampment policy in reservation of Articles 17 and 26 of the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. We sort of want to limit movement. We also limit in terms of access to employment for refugees. Reason being, the focus is on resettlement as well as voluntary repatriation. So this is sort of like a temporary situation. Unfortunately, it ends up being sort of permanent somewhat, because we have got refugees that have been in the camp for at least a decade or so. So when it comes now to children, we offer services, training, counseling services. We also offer just basic services. We try to listen to them. We try to offer counseling just to understand from their perspective what the issues are and to address them from their own perspective. Thank you, William.
All right. We've got about 10 minutes, and if anybody has any questions to put to any of the panelists, please raise your hand so that we can see that, or put it in the chat box. But let me, while I'm looking for if anybody has any questions, let me come back to Aaron then. And Aaron, when you were looking, you want to address that question that I had about African states exploring new markets, and particularly the market of the Gulf states, which have in many ways been countries of destination where there has been real human rights kind of abuses and exploitations being reported. Any thoughts on how African states will deal with that, or can possibly deal with that?
Thank you, William. Yes, we can look at it in both ways. One from the African side, where the supply of labor is coming from, and the other one from the countries of destination. In the GCM text itself, there is a commitment that member states have undertaken to review their policies and frameworks, both in general, that may or may not contribute to vulnerabilities, but also more specifically to review their relevant labor laws and policies. And again, with the view of providing some sort of corrective measures or preventive measures. However, especially when it comes to labor migration related policies and frameworks, a very important component or segment of the entire migration discourse, since the majority of migrants, international migrants at least, are economic in terms of their intention. However, this does not really provide a solution on its own. One of the things that we usually notice in countries' national migration governance frameworks is the sort of lack of coherence, lack of vertical coherence between the various policy domains. What you will find in your labor migration related frameworks may not be similar to what you'd find in your immigration related or national security related frameworks or policies. And for that, there is a best practice that I would like to mention from IOM, which is the establishment of national coordination mechanisms. It's basically a government platform where all government actors with mandate on migration come together precisely for the purpose of ensuring policy coherence. It's a very, very interesting concept, relatively new. Most of the interministerial committees that a lot of countries used to have only focuses on one issue, whether it is trafficking or labor migration or smuggling or protection or whatever. The national coordination mechanism is basically the manifestation of what IOM calls whole of government approach to migration governance. We have to look at migration in its entirety in order to resolve vulnerabilities. We can't, even by focusing on vulnerabilities, not a lot of progress will be made. This is one. The other point that I would like to mention is in terms of response, both countries, but particularly countries of destination, can institute a national referral mechanism, which is identifying vulnerabilities and addressing vulnerabilities with a referral mechanism in place, integrated in it. The referral mechanism is the part where the first responder or the government agency or whatever actor comes into first contact with the migrant, determines the vulnerability and refers them to the appropriate agency or actor, put simply. Now, these are the policy and programmatic sort of responses. However, and again, I can't help thinking that there is still a very fundamental discussion to be had in terms of vulnerabilities if we're going to seriously address it, and that is the question of the origins of the majority of vulnerable migrants. As I think both Memory alluded to it, but Sarah also had mentioned it. You have different categories of vulnerabilities. In the GCM text itself, of course, it's heavily on children and women. There's also persons with disabilities, older persons, etc. But it does not really extend to cover the whole range of situations where migrants can be vulnerable. And another very important common denominator that we see in many of the categories of vulnerable people are the fact that these are people of color. And this seems to be completely outside of the discussion. A lot of vulnerable migrants are A, irregular, and B, people of color. And we need to really understand this issue, the issue that race plays in terms of enhancing or even creating vulnerabilities. Another, perhaps for researchers who are interested in these issues, I would just invite or suggest to examine, the role of states in both generating and vulnerabilities and exacerbating vulnerabilities itself. The fact that migrants are irregular in status seems to be the primary factor in determining whether they are vulnerable or not. Thank you, William. Over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. And I see two hands. I will ask you to do it very quickly, Nagozi, and then NIT. Nagozi.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, Mr. Aaron, talking about vulnerability, can you make a connection between the migration externalization of the EU, whereby the RECs, the regional economic communities in Africa, are encouraged to engage in regional, inter-regional, intra-regional mobility, and then on the other hand, the EU avoids migration through these borders, or use migration border control to return some of the migrants from Europe. And this one also another one goes to memory. In Zimbabwe, the foster program, is it only for refugee unaccompanied children, or is it a cultural thing in Zimbabwe that happens not only to refugees but also to indigenous of Zimbabwe? Because this can encourage more abuse of the children if it's not something that is in the culture of the people. And to the other lady, the one that is having a is it Sarah? Yes, in your research method, it seems you use feminist research approach, or feminist participatory action research approach. Do you have indices that captured women labor migration and also human trafficking? And can you explain the result? Thank you.
All right, and IT, you want to come in here very quickly before we go back to the panel?
Thank you. My name is Annette Basi from Nigeria. We have heard about vulnerability, border patrol of countries by countries, and the main aim is to control who comes into their who comes into the country of destination. My take is, can we press on IOM to have a desk in maybe each border or each international airport, whereby they can give orientations to would-be migrants that are going into places. Look, this is what you expect. This is what you are going to see. This is what is expected of you. Because sometimes we see migrants just pick their bag, leave their house, buy air ticket, get visa, and off they fly, not knowing what they want to go and see. I remember a young man that came in from Cameroon and was telling me, Daddy, if you know that this man is going to suffer when he gets to Germany, nobody will celebrate his departure. So my question is that, can we press on IOM to have a DEX, maybe international export or borders, to give orientations to would-be migrants? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. And let's quickly wrap this up. And I think you, Aaron, you want to come first?
Thank you, William. Let me try to address the first question. The issue of externalizing borders. A very interesting topic, and which also more or less speaks to the earlier issue that I spoke about, that there is too much focus on individual vulnerabilities at the expense of the structural vulnerabilities that we really need to address. And just for the record, as of July of this year, I'm on an extended special leave from IOM. I'm working as a consultant now, but technically still bound by the institution's rules and regulations, and therefore cannot really speak on the programmatic details of my organization. But in general, when we look at the degrees of vulnerabilities, if you will, and I'm not on the protection side of migration management, I'm more of a policy and governance expert. But if you see the vulnerabilities, especially sub-Saharan African irregular migrants, their vulnerabilities tend to increase as they approach the European border. It's a very interesting relationship. And of course, it has to do with the measures, some of them necessary, some of them perhaps out of desperation, that some member states of the African Union had taken in order to regulate the irregular flow of people. How does this affect the really interesting frameworks? Some countries, for example, countries who are member states of the ECOWAS, have an obligation to facilitate a freer or easier movement of people. But by implementing these strict border management procedures, which are kind of a throwback to the older times, we have really progressed in terms of border management. The thinking has advanced extremely well. But this reversal to the older ways of managing or controlling borders seems to be eroding some of the free movement of persons protocol achievements, essentially restricting the movements of people who otherwise, and through regular means, do enjoy the right to freely cross borders, easily cross borders, of course, with all the preconditions fulfilled. So yes, that some of the policy approach taken by both the African side and the European side in terms of border management, the broader issue of border management, could very well be exacerbating vulnerabilities rather than improving them. Let me stop that part of the question here. Just a simple response to Aniti's question, whether IOM can establish help desks of some sort to irregular migrants. Yes, very wide practice. One of the best practices, in fact, is this establishment of migrant resource centers. It's one of the best practices in reducing vulnerabilities. And IOM has a lot of these centers in many countries. In West Africa, there are a lot. Thank you, William.
Thanks, Aaron. Very quickly, Sarah, I'll come to you just with a question that with regard to women migrants, if you could just very quickly respond to a question that has been on my mind, is that many countries resort to the banning of deployment of women, therefore, because they find themselves in vulnerable situations. Is banning a solution? Is the banning of women mobility a solution? Sarah?
Thank you, William, for that question, and also to Ngozi, I think it was, who raised the other question about the approach that I'm taking. You know, William, as a student myself, a PhD student, I have been doing a lot of reading, and I discovered that when it comes to the topic of gender, migration, the diaspora, there's very limited understanding of what roles women play. I have noticed that some of the literature that exists is actually viewing women from a victim perspective. And so some of the recommendations and even policies that are developed as a result of existing knowledge or biased knowledge is that these policies are mostly based on protectionist based policies. But I think that in my research and other emerging studies, we have seen that women play very important roles. Now, I don't think the concept of banning actually is effective because women, just like men, need to be respected and recognized. Their roles need to be recognized. And it's not anymore about protecting women. It's about looking at the factors that are contributing to their vulnerability. There have been a lot of campaigns recently that are recognizing the concept of not blaming the victim and not holding the victim accountable only, but also looking at other factors that have contributed to that vulnerability, and even the criminal cases. I have seen also in my study that women play very informal roles. They mobilize and galvanize support. In my case, I've been looking at the role of women in humanitarianism in Somalia, in development, in reconstructing their nations, and I have seen that they are organizing themselves at completely different levels than men do. Often informal, unofficial, not well organized, not well structured, but they play very important roles because in many floods in Somalia, in fact, they were the ones who initiated that mobilization. I think the coming back to Ngozi's question on what approach the benefits of taking a feminist approach. In my case, I took on the feminist transnationalism or feminist transnational approach. Now, this approach uses many concepts and many tools, which also includes the concept of intersectionality. And I understand that you are all familiar with this concept. It has allowed me to put proper questions in my questionnaire when asking the roles men and women play in providing humanitarian relief support, in complex crises in Somalia. I have seen also that sometimes they are the ones who are reaching faster or even stay longer. They are also taking part in structural development back home. So there are many benefits that this tool has allowed me to see, which other concepts or other tools would not have allowed. For example, it allowed me to see the diverse experiences of women who live between at the margins of boundaries of nation states around the globe, and how they transcend these boundaries, how they're able to interact with different forces, with relationships and experiences, living, the boundary, the borders are considered irrelevant in such cases. Women are able, the issues of mobility comes to question here. And I would have gone on to explain more about my work, but I'm afraid there isn't much time, William.
Thank you. Now, thanks, Sarah, for that, and thanks, Paul, for the response to that question. And I fully agree. I think there is a need to look at these situations and to recognize that these bans are not the answer, but recognizing the role that women play as development actors would be one way of trying to unpack some of this and coming to a proper kind of solutions that deal with vulnerabilities. Memory, last question for you then. As we move on in forced migration, there was a question put by Bercy first. You want to answer that? And then also say, if you want to say something about in terms of for children and vulnerabilities, and whether it is you mentioned 4 different categories of migration. And I know you said you focused largely on forced migration, but even in other forms of migration, the best interests of the child, what would that mean? Memory?
Thanks very much, William, and thanks, Ngozi, for your question. In Zimbabwe, when we talk of foster care, this is something that is administered or regulated by the Ministry of Public Service, Labor and Social Welfare, who also happen to be like the administrators of Tongogara refugee camp. So this is not just a refugee program only, but it is a national program. So the foster care system is actually a national program, and we have Zimbabwean nationals, unaccompanied minors, or just minors, neglected minors, who are also placed under foster care in Zimbabwe. And maybe just to respond quickly to what Aaron was saying, when we talk of maybe vulnerability, I think this is a very, very broad topic, and we need to not only be reactive, but also to be proactive. Governance issues, we have issues to do with structural violence, we have issues to do with procedures and policies that are not implemented, and this is something that we need to address at a global scale, not just to react to issues to do with mobility, but also to prevent mobility if it can be prevented. In my case, when we look at forced migration, we have forced migrants or refugee seekers coming all the way from mostly the Great Lakes region because of conflict, because of war. We need to know why it is happening. We need to understand the dynamics of war. We need to at least address those situations before they actually into my and in terms of the best interest of the child, in everything that is done in Zimbabwe, we look at Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is the best interest of the child. In our response, or in the response to the vulnerabilities of children, you remember in my presentation I was talking about engaging with the children. It is not just a matter of making decisions for them, but also finding out from them what it is that they would want to happen, and they need to have a say. It is said that anything for us without us is not for us. So it's important, to continue to understand the dynamics that, you need to hear them out. For me, amplifying the voice of children is very pertinent, and this can only be done through understanding from their perspective, engaging them in some form of dialogue, and this is what needs to be done if we are to map a way forward. Of course, we also need to understand that them being minors, it's, they may not always make the best decisions for themselves, or they may not always know what it is that is right for them. But at least let's amplify their voice, let's hear them out, and understand from their perspective. If we have divergent views, then we need to explain to them why we cannot do it their own way when it comes to issues to do with vulnerability and migration. I'll just state an example wherein, like I said, culturally, big culture but when you engage in a dialogue with the children, then you explain to them how this is not right for them, and eventually they'll get it right. So it's not always best to actually allow them to do things their own way, but we also need to explain to them the pros and the cons of the decisions that they would want to make.
All right. Thank you, Memory, and thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Sarah, for the conversation today. I think it has been a
thank you very much. I've been looking at vulnerability. Sorry, William, I have a quick question. Maybe I would like for Aaron, I would like to address this to Aaron. We often look at migrants from a vulnerable perspective, but what about situations wherein we have migrants perpetuating violence, migrants being engaged in South an issue? Some school children died from ingesting some noodles or something that were manufactured by Somali nationals. What's your take on how migrants behave, especially labor migrants behave when they get into these third world or these third countries of migration?
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Memory. I think, Aaron, you'll have to take it up bilaterally with Memory at some stage. But we have exceeded 15 minutes beyond the time and so I would like to wrap it up here just by saying thank you to Memory, Aaron, and Sarah for that wonderful conversation. We have looked at vulnerabilities that are structural and vulnerabilities that are personal and lived experiences. We have understood vulnerabilities from a woman feminist perspective, and we have looked at vulnerabilities from a child's perspective. And we have seen that throughout the migration discourse, there is a need to understand what is the context of these vulnerabilities and how to have dialogue around these vulnerabilities so that migrants finding themselves in these situations can also come out of these situations. There was a good comment there with regard to connections between vulnerabilities, GCM Objective 7, and the drivers of migration, GCM 2. And that might be something to explore even further, because somewhere the drivers of migration might be also the causes of some of the vulnerable contexts that migrants find themselves in. That might be something to look at and for a further conversation. But thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to the next conversation that we will have. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paddy. Thank you, Rakesh, and the rest of the team.
Thank you very much, William.
Thank you.